morning, everybody. If we're ready, I think we'll get started. I'm not sure if I'm mic'd up adequately, but I will speak forcefully and we'll be fine. I'm Steve Call. I'm the president of the New America Foundation. Thanks for being with us this morning. I hope we're going to have a really rich and informative discussion about an event that none of us would have expected to be discussing together a year ago. And we have a terrific panel and program. I hope your participation will be part of it as we go along. Just to give you a preview of what we intend to do, we have three speakers. Each of them will come up and present a little bit of an update. The news was just released last night by the Tunisian election authorities of the preliminary count. And so we wanted, first of all, to put us all on the same page with what exactly happened in the first free elections to follow the Arab Spring. We have two panelists who participated as observers in the elections on the ground. All of us have been out there who are going to participate in the conversation. We're sorry we don't have a Tunisian on the panel this morning, but those we asked were running for parliament or otherwise disposed, and we're fortunate to have a group with rich and recent experience in Tunisia and in the election. I think we want to really use this conversation to talk about two things. One is, first of all, Tunisia itself, which is, I think, understandably to some extent, but frustratingly to a greater extent, neglected as a subject unto itself in the Arab Spring. It has been the genesis of so much change, not only in the Arab world, but beyond. And it's a small country that is not very well known in the United States, but it's important just unto itself, and it is quite a distinct country from the others that have also been stimulated to pursue change. And so I think we're going to spend some time just talking about Tunisia, Tunisian politics, the political parties that were revived or formed after Ben Ali's departure, the results of the election, what they signal in a Tunisian context. And then secondly, we will talk about the echoes and the implications for elsewhere, Egypt, of course, being foremost on most people's minds. Its moment in the sun, comparable to the free and long awaited lines that formed around polling stations in Tunisia, seems delayed, but the events in Tunisia will no doubt create both models and pressure for Egypt that we should reflect on together. And I'm sure the panelists will have many more reflections than I can articulate beyond Egypt and elsewhere in the region. So we'll proceed with two speakers for sure, and a third who's arriving after dropping his son at school. So we're going to do it in order that we intended anyway. Leila Hilal, my colleague, is the co-director of New America's Middle East Task Force. She will speak first and brief us about the election results. She was an observer to the elections, just returned from Tunisia about a week or so ago. She was, for 5 years, a legal advisor to the Palestinian Negotiations Department. She's advised the Palestinian Constitutional Committee on drafting their basic laws. She's been a senior policy advisor to the Commissioner General of the UN Palestinian Refugee Agency for the last couple of years before joining us just this autumn. We're very fortunate to have her. She succeeds Amjad Atallah, who's gone to Al Jazeera to run their Americas Department as the co-director with Daniel Levy of our Middle East work. She has a law degree from SUNY and an LLM from Harvard Law. I'm going to introduce Stephen, the executive director of the Project on Middle East Democracy, who will follow Leila now. He was previously the director of advocacy there and has been traveling back and forth to the Middle East thinking about a transition of this type for 6 years or longer. He's written widely on the Middle East and on democracy movements there, and has a master's degree from Stanford. And when Daniel arrives, many of you know him as a senior advisor at the United States Institute for Peace and also associate professor at Georgetown University. He's taught at Emory and elsewhere, and his publications include Reinventing Khomeini and conflict, identity, and reform in the Muslim world challenges for United States engagement. So with that, Layla, why don't you come up? She'll talk for a little while. Stephen will come up. We'll keep the slides up to digest the results, and then we'll have a moderated conversation and invite you in.
Okay, so welcome everyone. I want to begin by commending the Tunisian people for what was a very successful election. It was fundamentally well organized, highly transparent, and that's from my own firsthand witness of the process. And then there were high participation rates. There are different figures flying around, and of course the final numbers are not yet available, but somewhere between 70 to 90% of registered voters participated in the elections. So that is, of course, good news and deserving of many congratulations. For those who are perhaps less familiar with the Tunisian scene, I just want to speak briefly to what the elections were for, and that was a 217-member National Constituent Assembly, whose primary role will be to draft a new constitution, which will then be put to a public referendum. The Assembly will have a limited duration of 1 year, or at least that is what was agreed by several parties to the process. The mandate and the duration of the existence of the Assembly is emerging as a point of difference between the parties, but generally speaking, its primary function is to draft a new constitution and establish the next system of governance and Bill of Rights for Tunisia. The elections followed a closed list proportional representation system with a parity principle requiring that candidates list equal numbers of alternating men and women. Now, I believe that most of the major parties put forward a male as the head of the list, and so the percentage of women in the parliament will be around 24%. That's an unconfirmed number. Maybe Steve has the actual figure or the confirmed figure. And that compares favorably to other countries. In the US, 17% of Congress is female. So, another congratulations to Tunisia for this success. And of course, I'm sure there will be further developments around the situation of women in the country, as that really emerged as a major discursive element in this election scene. Now, there were a proliferation of parties and independent lists for candidacy in this election. There were 80 formal parties. A total of 1,600 lists were submitted with 11,688 candidates. The new election commission limited the conducting of pre-election polls, but the few that were done, as well as focus groups that were gathered together by organizations like NDI, showed that the public was very confused by what was an extremely complex candidacy. The numbers, the different issues that were up for election there was a lack of clarity, and that perhaps also impacted the process, as people may have been under the impression that they were not necessarily voting for people who would define the normative regime of the future Tunisia, but in fact voting for a president or a personality. The Tunisian election law provided for a very tightly regulated electoral process, and I think that impacted the actual outcome. In particular, there were tight controls on campaigning and financing. and while there were no reports of serious violation, well, there were reports of serious violations such as vote buying and election commission biases in favor of Ennahda, the Islamist party. What observers witnessed on the ground was that there was substantial compliance with governing rules during the elections and a general competence and commitment on the part of administrators, observers, and voters alike. And from my vantage point, the breakdown came when the polls closed. So the process proceeded smoothly, but then when the counting and tabulation began, things became very drawn out, and there were several administrative delays and repeats. That's why the initial results, preliminary results, were expected to be released on Tuesday, but only came out, I believe, last night, this morning, and they are still in the process of refinement. And so here on this graph, we have some numbers. I would caution before you quote them, because they were numbers that we had tallied as of yesterday at around 5 o'clock, and they have since been slightly revised. This is a dynamic process. The preliminary results, as I said, were confirmed or came out, released to this just recently. But a novelty in the Tunisian election law is that there can be party challenges in court, and there are parties have up to 48 hours to make those challenges. And given the rumors and accusations that have been flying about the different winning parties, it's quite possible that we will see a legal challenge, and I think Steve will address that in more detail. So just briefly, as you know, the main headline is that the Islamist party, Ennahda, won the election, essentially, and took the greatest number of seats. We have here 46%, but the number today is 41%. There were a few surprises in this election, one of which was the rise of the Congress for the Republic, the CPR, which came in second with some 13% of the seats, beating out the Progressive Democratic Party. The main surprise of the election has been the around 10% win of Arid Hashabia, which is led by a very erratic, enigmatic character from the interior of the country. He has been subject to great ridicule on social media, and the Election Commission has actually revised downward and cancelled a number of the lists due to what I believe are violations of the financial regulations. But in response, there have been demonstrations in the leader's hometown of Sidi Bouzid, because people are perceiving an imbalance in the treatment of the party, and I'll speak a bit to what this means in a minute. Etekato is a centrist party, a social democratic party, and they came out with around 10–11%, which was as expected. The PDP, the Progressive Democratic Party, was a party led by a long-term critic of Ben Ali. It's a secular leftist party. It was expected to do much better than it performed, and we can talk a bit about implications of its poor performance. The PDM is one of the one of two coalitions. As I said, there was this proliferation of parties, an unfortunate situation of a lack of coalition building. PDM attempted to pursue that coalition. It did not have a wide inclusion of parties, and it's very strong secular positions led it to come out with 9% or approximately 9% of the seats. And then we have Al Mubadara and Affek Tunis, which are parties that were either perceived to be or actually aligned or associated with the former ruling party, and they had a collective outcome of around 5% of the vote. The Tunisian Workers' Communist Party is a very popular party, and as those of you who may have followed the revolution, we know that the syndicates, the unions, were quite responsible for for driving this revolution, at least in its early days. Yet it did not have strong appeal in the elections, and I think that that's an interesting dynamic that we may want to discuss. So what do the surprise results tell us about the future directions of the country? What will be the future priorities? I think that there are 4 factors that are important when trying to sort of deconstruct the results. One is the factor that the impact factor of the association with the former regime. The other is regionalism. Third is the politics of victimhood, and fourth factor that had an influence in this process was media access, as well as what I'll say is human resources. So let me just quickly address these points before handing it over to Steve. Several parties, as I said, were slated to do well, and there were also a number of parties that spent a great deal on campaigning. These parties did poorly. So what we saw is that the parties that appeared to have a great deal of financial support, parties that were sort of leading the debate, actually were not voted into the assembly. For instance, the UPL party, which is considered to have a lot of money, to be very closely aligned with a pro-business agenda, was expected to come out ahead, and it actually, I think, only received one seat. Affek Tunis is also perceived to be a very elitist entity, and it also performed poorer than expected. So I think that this means really that the ruling party, the former ruling party of the RCD, is essentially dead, and you do not have the same sort of situation in Egypt, where you have remnants of the regime that continue to maintain power. So you have a new era in Tunisia, and that is a positive development. Regionalism, the surprise win of Aridha is attributed in large part to Hamdi's play on the interior versus coastal divide in the country. And the coastal cities of Tunisia have benefited from tourism and industrialization, whereas the interior was neglected by Ben Ali and suffers from isolation and underdevelopment. And that difference was very much part of Hamdi's campaigning. And now, as we see his list revised, there's an emerging anger within the interior against what is perceived to be elitism of the coastal areas. So the question is, of course, will these social tensions continue to play out, and how will the assembly and the new government address them? The third factor of influence was victimhood, and Ennahda, I would say, capitalized more on its position of opposition than it did on its support for religious precepts. In fact, it in its campaigning emphasized quite heavily its embrace of liberal principles, especially vis-a-vis women. Other parties who came out well also played up their victimhood. Aridha Shabia also, portrayed itself as the underdog against both the elitism of the coastal areas as well as against the former regime. So I think this victimhood card will only sort of be a powerful tactic for parties for only so long, and eventually substance will come out over symbolism. So the last influential factor that I want to note is the resources and media access. The Election Commission restrictions on campaigning gave Ennahda an advantage. Ennahda was very well organized and extremely tactical in its campaigning. It relied less on money and financing and more on family and personal networks. It engaged in door-to-door canvassing. It had observers in literally every polling station. So they took advantage of the competitive electoral process and won. Many of the liberal parties complained of national media bias, and there were many reports that the Electoral Commission were biased against independent list observers and in favor of Ennahda. These reports, to my knowledge, have not been confirmed, but this was some of the complaints that were circulating. So while we can say that Ennahda was clearly tactical and did well in its efforts, there are also at least some perceptions of bias. Ennahda and all the major winners had their own media channels. The commission limited advertising of campaign advertising to specific locations with designated spaces of equal size. So those who had independent media sources or private media sources also were able to claim advantage. So I think in a sense, while we see Ennahda coming out with a very large chunk of seats, a question remains as to whether or not the next election in a year's time for a new government, if in fact it happens in a year's time, whether or not the independents will think more strategically about how they approach the elections, and whether or not Tunisia will revise its campaigning and finance rules to equalize the playing field to get more of these independent voices out. So with these comments, I'll turn it over to Steve.
Thanks, Layla. I'll pick up sort of where Layla left off and add my own comments and observations on interpretations of some of the things that happened this week in Tunis, and I'll also add a little bit about my thoughts on implications for the broader region as a whole, as well as implications for U.S. policy and how the U.S. can and should react in the wake of these elections. In general, I echo everything that Layla said, that these elections in many respects are very positive, and I sort of echo her congratulations to the Tunisian people. Until say the last 36 hours, everyone in Tunisia seemed to be very much glowing and very proud of the results, and it was quite remarkable, and in many respects sort of exceeded all expectations. My last visit to Tunis was a 2-week visit in the middle of August, and I would say that at that time people did not expect the turnout to be. People were very concerned turnout might be quite low. In fact, on Sunday the turnout was estimated around 90% of those voters that had registered to vote. There were also lots of concerns, just simply, as recently as 6 to 8 weeks ago, there were serious concerns over whether the Independent Electoral Commission that was formed this year would be able to properly administer the elections. There were lots of fears that they had were getting a late start in organizing, and that they would not be sufficiently prepared technically to administer the elections properly, and to gain the faith and confidence of all of the major parties. I had said, and prior to the elections, that the elections would be a success if the results were accepted as credible by all of the major parties. It was considered likely that there would be a lot of small parties excluded, that would not gain any seats at all, and that they might react by rejecting the process or saying that the elections were rigged against them. I believed that if all of the 8 to 10 largest parties all accepted the results as credible, then we could move forward without interruption. That has mostly happened, but one of the big surprises, which Layla mentioned a bit, was this party, Rita Shabia, led by Hashmi Hamdi. Our organization, POMED, published about 9 days before the elections, we published a guide to the Tunisian elections that some of you might have picked up out front. In it, we included profiles of the 10 parties that were polling the highest at the time that polling was allowed until October 1st. We also include the one independent list that was polling the highest. Rita Shabia was not among those, and the results came out on Sunday, and there was lots of surprise that in the preliminary results that were first released on Monday from a few of the polling places, Rita Shabia initially was in 3rd place, and then by yesterday they were in 4th place, and they were a party that not only had we overlooked, but the polling had overlooked. And I talked to one of my colleagues, Daphne McCurdy, who wrote this report, is in Tunis now, and she was there for the elections and still there. And I've spoken to her every day this week, and other contacts of ours in Tunisia. And there's been a lot of surprise and confusion over where this party came from and why they did so well. And then now more recently, the Independent Electoral Commission, as I understand it, have declared 6 of their lists, 6 of the seats that they had won, to be invalid. There's remains some confusion about why exactly why. It appears that it's officially they're being declared invalid because of violating rules on campaign financing, which is the main reason that the Electoral Commission would have the authority to declare them invalid at this point. But then there's also some confusion and suspicion more broadly about this party. And then, unfortunately, now, just as of yesterday, all this controversy has led to some violence in Sidi Bouzid, where the mayor's office has been set on fire. And I was looking this morning, I said some pictures, and some violence continues there. And Sidi Bouzid, of course, is the place where the protest movement began when Mohamed Bouazizi burned himself to death in December. And it's also the hometown of Hashmi Hamdi, the head of this list. Although Hashmi Hamdi, and I think Dan Brumberg will maybe speak a little bit more also about this. He mentioned to me that he's interacted with Hashmi Hamdi for many years in the past, and he's a little bit of a mysterious figure, and he seems to be coming across. In Tunisia, one strange thing about him is that he's also not been back to Tunisia, as I understand it, since before the revolution. He's remained in London, and he's been the head of one of this party that was relatively unknown. There were 80 parties that were registered that had lists officially approved to compete in the elections. Of those 80, there were 10 or 12 that were relatively well known. There were 70 others that people knew very little about, and his seems to be the only one of those 70 that unexpectedly has done very well in the elections. And there's a lot of confusion and suspicion over exactly how that came about. There are, by some there are, accusations and suspicions that he may have some sort of ties to some people in the Ministry of Interior or otherwise that are involved in the running of elections. But the truth is basically nobody seems to have any idea, at this point. I think it's too early to say, but it calls for alarm and concern, and we'll continue to watch, and hopefully the violence that's erupted in Sidi Bouzid will come to an end very quickly and not spread elsewhere. With that late emerging unsettling point, aside, in general, the elections have gone very well. And I would say that, in terms of lessons from these elections, one thing I would say is that the election sort of proved that voter outreach works. I mean, a lot of the parties on the ground seem to sort of learn that lesson, that the places in which they invested the most time on the ground interacting with voters were the places where they did well and got seats maybe that they didn't expect to. The parties that seemed most energetic when I was in Tunisia in August, Nahda certainly, and Takatul and CPR, which ended up being the three parties that gained the most number of seats. I think they all had very sort of energetic movements of sort of mobilizing and reaching out to voters. They also, in general, had more of this sort of younger generation flocking to support them. PDP, which was the party that had in general polled second in most of the polling through the end of September, and was the best known party certainly in the country after Nahda, as of several months ago. Did not do so well, and they wound up finishing. It looks like now fourth or fifth, depending on how things shake out with the Rida Shabia and their disqualifications. The PDP, my impression in August was that they were a party that was very well known, had very high name recognition. Najib Chebi was very well known himself, but they had not seemed to attract the younger generation. They not seemed to attract many new supporters, and they had a larger base of supporters than most of the other parties had before the revolution. But they had sort of failed to they were sort of sitting on their base, and sort of they were advertising and speaking, but sort of failing to kind of mobilize the same kind of get out the vote effort that we've seen that has really worked. I would also say the elections sent a sort of signal that people really want a clear break from the past. It seems that one of the biggest focuses for people in voting was anti-corruption. The parties that were likely to bring an end to corruption, and the parties that were seen as sort of least connected to or tied to the old regime in any way, for the most part. And a lot of Nahda voters, of course, Nahda is known as an Islamist party, but I mean, it seems as though a lot of their supporters and voters were motivated as much by the fact that they were, they had been entirely banned by the Ben Ali regime and repressed brutally by the Ben Ali regime, and they were seen as a very clear break from that past. And they generally are perceived to be, a party that is whether people agree with sort of their political agenda, they're respected as sort of having integrity and not seen as being corrupt. And that's a quality that's perception that you'll see in some of the other countries by the Islamist parties as well. And I think that's a big part of their success. And I think it would be too simple to accredit their success to a desire by the Tunisian population primarily to be governed by a party rooted more in Islamic values as opposed to some of its other attributes. One last thing I would say in terms of interpreting the results would be that it seems to be the vote seems to be sort of a rejection of polarization. The leftist secularist parties that had campaigned most adamantly against Nahda and sort of in rejecting Nahda and refusing to work with Islamists, the PDP and Tajdeed being the largest party of the PDM, which the coalition that finished with only, I believe, 5 seats or about 2% of the seats. They both performed much worse than expected, and those are the two parties that, really a lot of their campaign kind of rested on kind of rejection of Islamist politics and rejection of Nahda, and swearing to their supporters that they would not cooperate with Nahda and they would not enter a coalition with them, etc. And they performed very poorly in the election. And those leftist secularist parties, CPR and Takatul, that did quite well, now it appears will enter into a ruling coalition in the Constituent Assembly with the Nahda, which I think itself is a very positive thing. And we don't have, in terms of trends of elections in the broader Arab world, it's almost hard to speak of trends in elections, in real or meaningful elections in the Arab world, because there have been so few. But when there have been elections in the Arab world, we've seen Islamist movements of different kinds do well in those elections. the result has often been kind of very stark polarization between the Islamist movements and the other parties that are more secular or leftist or liberal parties. So this could be sort of important historic difference in that we could see the Constituent Assembly and the Constitution written by a operating coalition of an Islamist party and two major secular leftist parties, which hopefully could sort of set example for that kind of cooperation in some of the other Arab countries. In terms of the impact on the broader Arab world, of course, Tunisia is the country that started this Arab Spring, with the protests and the ouster of Ben Ali in January, and now these are the first free elections of the Arab Spring. I think that these are potentially a very powerful example that hopefully will be looked to by many other countries. This election certainly were watched across the Arab world. I actually just returned. I just arrived about 12 hours ago from Egypt, from where I was this week, and it was the second time this year that I've been in Egypt while Tunisia has experienced historic milestones. I was in Cairo when Ben Ali stepped down on the 14th of January, and at that time, Cairo and Egypt was sort of very energized, and everyone in Cairo was talking about the revolution in Tunisia and Ben Ali stepping down. On Sunday, I was actually somewhat surprised and disappointed a little bit that Egyptians were not sort of captivated by the Tunisian elections as much as I was, I think, and they weren't drawn to them the degree that I would have hoped, and not at all the way the elections in Tunisia didn't seem to capture the imagination of the Egyptian people the way that the revolution did in January and the ouster of Ben Ali. Nonetheless, I mean, everyone in Egypt was well aware of these elections. Egypt, of course, has their own elections, their parliamentary elections coming up in about a month. And I think there are many things that Egypt and other Arab countries could learn from the Tunisian elections. Unfortunately, I'm sort of less optimistic about Egypt's upcoming elections, although they're still a month away. There's lots of signs that they're not going to be as freely or fairly conducted as the elections in Tunisia. In general, the political environment now in Egypt is much less open and free than in Tunisia, where in Egypt you have a military council that's sort of being heavy-handed and trying to really steer the process. In Tunisia, I think Tunisia, for the most part, had the good fortune of having a relatively weak technocratic interim government that's been in charge, that's been managing the transition throughout the year. And it's an interim government that had really no power of their own to protect. In Egypt, you'll see that the military that's in charge is trying to really steer the political process and the political transition in such a way to protect their own power. In Tunisia, the military is much less political, and you didn't really have bodies in charge of this process that are trying to steer things to their own result. Now, the flip side of that, the sort of downside of having a relatively weak government in charge during the interim period, is that now, as some controversies start to emerge regarding disqualification of candidates from Arita Shabia's list, and now some violence start to erupt, and there's some questioning of there may be some questioning of the decisions that are made by this electoral commission. There may be, and a stronger body might be able to get through that sort of thing more easily. So we'll see, in the days ahead, what happens in that respect. The last thing I want to mention is in terms of what this means for the United States and U.S. policy. In general, I would say that Tunisia's elections and Tunisia's transition poses a real opportunity for the U.S. Tunisia is almost unique in the Arab world in that across the different lines, the Islamist party, the secular leftist parties, all the different groups you talk to in Tunisia, there seems to be a rather unusual consensus in Tunisia about wanting to see a stronger relationship with the United States. That contrasts very strongly with many of the Arab countries where most discussions of the United States revolve around unwanted influence, and they want the U.S. to be less involved, and they're afraid of the U.S. interference. In Tunisia, that people want very much to see a strong relationship with the United States, including the Islamists, Nahda. Some in most other Arab countries, the Islamists are sort of seen as opposed to American interest and/or values. In Tunisia, the U.S. particularly looks good to many people by contrast with France. The U.S. and France are often seen as sort of the two big powers that are perhaps likely to play the biggest role from outside in Tunisia. And the French, in many eyes, were very tarnished by their close associations with Ben Ali. In some respects, as the U.S. is viewed in Egypt with our close association with Mubarak, we're not tarnished in that same way in Tunisia, but the French are. And the French, during the protest, the French foreign minister had made comments about perhaps sending French police to Tunisia or to help train the Tunisian police and put down the protest. Those comments after Ben Ali's ouster led to the French foreign minister being fired and replaced. And the Islamist party in particular, Nahda, very much is very suspicious about the French and the French very strong tradition of secularism, and the French ties to some of the secular parties, including some that fared very quite poorly in these elections. And the United States involvement and support is generally quite welcomed. Of course, given the budget environment here in the U.S. can't provide the kind of assistance that we may have provided to countries undergoing transitions in the past. But I think there are lots of other opportunities for the U.S. to play a supporting role in Tunisia's transition, hopefully establish a stronger relationship by expanding trade and investment, and as well as just other kind of programs that strengthen ties between the U.S. and Tunisia. About 3 weeks ago, it was announced that the U.S. is returning the Peace Corps to Tunisia, which has been gone since the mid-1990s. And I think that's a positive step, and hopefully we'll see other kinds of steps along these lines taken. But I do think it's very important that the U.S. continue to be seen as on the side of transition to democracy in Tunisia. And I think if this transition is successful, it could be a very powerful model across the Arab world. I think the Arab world is the entire region is could really benefit by having an indigenous model within the Arab world without having to look. People, as these transitions are emerging, people try to look to Turkey or Indonesia or try to look for a model that can work in the Arab world. And if we could actually have a successful indigenous model within the region, I think it could be very powerful. Thanks.
Well, thanks, Steve, very much for inviting me to this important meeting this morning. I want to say that, as mention was made of me getting my son to school, that the operation was a success this morning. We had observers on board to watch the entire operation, and I'm glad that we were able to fulfill that mission. Much, I think, has been said already that I wanted to say, which is perfectly good, and I think I largely agree with the conclusions and observations. I was not in Tunisia for the elections. I was there a few weeks ago on behalf of both the United States Institute of Peace and Georgetown University. We're looking at assisting Tunisian universities with the establishment of democracy study centers in a number of public universities in Tunisia, so we're active on the ground in many areas there. And mostly I was there for purposes of these sorts of organizational missions and activities. But I did get a chance to speak to a number of political actors. I'm a scholar mostly of Iran and Egypt, and this was my first trip to Tunisia, although curiously enough, I do know personally both Ghanouchi Marzouki and Mohammed al-Hashmi Hamdi over the years. It's funny how these things seem to work out, and someone that you knew X years ago may become, it's not inconceivable when the Marzouki would become president elected by the parliament, although I think it's probably Chebbi who's more likely to get the nod, but we'll see. We'll see how that works out. I want to make a few comparative remarks, more putting on my professor's hat for a moment about Tunisia. I am extremely optimistic about what's going on in Tunisia, and I've always believed, and I've said so in public events for many years now, that if there was one country that would make the transition to democracy, it was Tunisia. And I believe that there's a certain kind of interesting paradox when we look at Tunisia and compare it to Egypt. Tunisia was a classic despotism, a one-man show, one party, a clientelistic party built completely on clientelism without any ideological pretensions whatsoever. A bureaucracy that was that enforced the clientelistic sort of politics and used the secret police more than the army, but really the police, the secret police, the security forces, to intimidate. I never went to Tunisia because I work on democracy issues now for 15 years plus, and I didn't feel like getting the treatment that many of my colleagues got when they went there. I couldn't get anything done, so I felt I went there, didn't want to go there. But I went to Egypt because Egypt was what I call a liberalized autocracy, and it was all kinds of NGOs, political parties. You could say almost anything you wanted about the regime, but you had to be careful. There are certain vague red lines, but it was a system that in some sense existed by the manipulation of a certain state-managed pluralism that provided for a degree of political activism and engagement between the regime and the opposition. And there, the lines were always blurred between opposition and state, between those who were part of the ruling elite and those who were against it. And that sort of blurring of the lines was effectively manipulated by the regime to undermine and divide the opposition. Whereas, of course, with the exception of maybe one party, there was a very clear line between the state, who was running it on one hand, and the opposition in Tunisia. And basically, you were either linked to the state and part of it, or you were outside of it and opposed to it. And under those conditions, what happened was that the state was complete, and its ruling apparatus was completely discredited in a way that is, of course, turns out to be extremely beneficial, because it's provided a kind of clean slate. Not totally clean. You never, the institutional sort of legacies of the past never completely disappear. Mohammed al-Hashmi Hamdi's party is indicative of that interesting sort of phenomenon. But in many respects, what you had is an opportunity to rebuild from the ground up in Tunisia in a way that you don't have in Egypt. In Egypt, what I call the field of manipulation and the menu of manipulation, if you like, a term that I'm borrowing from a Mexican scholar who works on the Mexican authoritarianism, the menu of manipulation is much richer. And the opportunity for the military, which is obviously, and Steve pointed this out, much stronger and has economic interests in Egypt for which the Tunisian military cannot compete. Tunisian military is really not a clientelistic or rent-seeking body as the way the Egyptian military has evolved highly in the economy. The military and its various institutional alliances have been and allies have been able to manipulate this field and really try to rework the liberalized autocracy of the past into some sort of new version, a kind of quasi-democracy. We'll see how that pans out, but I think ultimately it's going to be something that that reinvents many of the previous institutions of the regime, at least initially. That may not hold, but I think in at least a year or two following the elections, we're going to see a lot of that, and we can see that the Ikhwan Muslimin in Egypt is effectively facilitating that strategy. They might want to deny it. I'm certain that they would, but my judgment is so far that the Ikhwan's main goal in Egypt is to attain political power, and it will make whatever political alliances it needs to do in order to reach that point. And I don't think that's the perspective of Ghannouchi and the Nakhta party in Tunisia, which has a very different approach. And all politicians are instrumental and opportunistic to some point or other. But I think we see in Tunisia, and I think Steve is correct in this regard, a new model. In fact, something that's unprecedented for the Arab world, and that is a readiness of Islamists and non-Islamists or secular parties to engage in serious discussions of creating a political alliance that will create the framework for the writing of a new constitution. And that sort of power-sharing alliance, it's not going to be, and it should not be, hopefully, anything that is akin to the kind of consociational arrangement we have in Lebanon, which is essentially a form of ceasefire. What one would hope is that this be a real consultation of parties and a real dialogue that would provide a real basis for consensual politics that moves beyond the tactics of consensus to a real strategic consensus. And I'm quite optimistic that's going to happen. And it's also remarkable to the extent to which, and I think this map really demonstrates it, Tunisia is a country that is both united and at the same time divided. There are clearly different constituencies with different views, not only on economic and social issues, but on the whole question of the mosque-state relationship. It would have been possible for Nakhta to take a very polarized position on this question, but instead the Nakhta party is evolving in a way that echoes the AK party in Turkey. And when I was in Tunisia some weeks ago, Erbakan was there. You know the two flags are very similar, and throughout Tunis there were posters with the two flags, one next to the other, emphasizing, of course the Tunisians were delighted that somebody was paying attention to them and greatly relieved. It had to be Turkey, perhaps. Erbakan was on a whirlwind tour of the region, and when he got to Cairo, he lectured the Ikhwan Muslimin and told them that they had to take a secular approach to politics, which was not what they were expecting Erdogan to say. But by the time he got to Tunis, that view was welcome, because Ghannouchi, and particularly people around Ghannouchi more so, have been advocating a kind of notion of the state which echoes the American experience, a state whose job will be not to enforce or impose an Islamist agenda, but one that will create space for people to pursue their religious beliefs in the ways that they choose. Now, from the point of view of the secular groups, many of them think this, believe that this kind of neo-modernist position, if you like, is simply subterfuge. They were very concerned that this was a double langage, a double language, being used by the Ghannouchi to essentially deflect concerns from the modernist, liberal, secular camp, and that as soon as the party gets into power, it would reverse that policy and impose a much more stringent kind of fundamentalist approach. Thus far, we don't see indications of that. But I think it's important to remind ourselves that one of the things that the despotism did under the previous regime was act as a kind of protection racket. There was a certain social contract by which the state provided a certain degree of economic, social, and if you like, ideological protection to certain non-Islamist secular elements of the population, particularly the bourgeoisie and elements of the professional intelligentsia, which ultimately became disillusioned with that arrangement. But there's always the fear that, there's always the concern that whereas the previous authoritarian protection racket was not very palatable, at least it provided some degrees of safety and security. And what the challenge is for Ghannouchi now and the leaders of his party is to demonstrate to those who believe they have the most to lose from democracy that they can have the most to gain. And they can have the most to gain because there will be guarantees of their rights as individuals and also their group rights that will be protected as much by their parties as by Nahda party as well. And if we can move from an authoritarian protection racket to a democratic protection politics in which the rights of all are guaranteed, and Nahda demonstrates that it is ready to do this, this will be a positive development, and one that I think, as Steve pointed out, will have an echo effect, particularly in Libya. That's the next big sort of question mark right next door, and where perhaps the regional effect will be strongest. The Egyptians are not about to say, oh, we're listening to the Tunisians. I mean, I lived for 3 years in Egypt and never got a sense that the Egyptians would say, well, once Tunisia yes, they were inspired by the revolt, but after that they were doing their own thing. And so I'm not the least surprised that they're saying, well, you know, we're not gonna, congratulations to Tunisia, but we're Egypt. But in Libya, there's going to be an interesting question about whether the Libyan regime, as it emerged, a democratic regime, can take a page from the Tunisian experience, because Libya is in many respects also profoundly divided along different kinds of lines. Now, I do think we have to recognize that as the Nahda party negotiates the creation of an interim government, which will have 1 year to fulfill its mission, and that its primary mission is to create a new constitution, but it will be functioning as a government. It will elect a president. There was, about 6 weeks before the elections, there was an effort by some of the secular parties to propose a referendum. The idea was that the referendum would establish or limit the activities and the authorities of the Constituent Assembly merely to creating a constitution. There was great fear that the Constituent Assembly would emerge as a policy-making body that wouldn't create laws that would prejudice the secular groups. And for a while, it seemed that this whole debate was going to lead to a breakdown in the whole process. And then there was a series of negotiations and effectively a kind of political pact between Nahda and the main parties that set out a set of procedures, which was really, I think, an important step in setting the stage for these elections, and also for a Constituent Assembly that will pick from within its members a smaller body, because Constituent Assemblies are horrible institutions for creating constitutions. I mean, you can't get 217 people to agree on a constitution. The idea is insane. What you really want to do is pick a smaller group who meets, closes the door, locks the door if necessary, and concentrates, and then comes up with something and then goes back to the people, perhaps in a referendum. But even that has to be decided on by the Constituent Assembly. So there's a lot that has to be decided on, and it's going to be a difficult year. It's going to be a difficult year because the economy in Tunisia is in very serious shape. The tourist industry is way down. The recession in Europe makes it likely that even if Tunisia stabilizes, the numbers of people who usually come for vacations from Europe and also Central Europe and Eastern Europe will be far fewer, and this is going to put enormous pressure on the ruling, on a new democratic government. I do worry about what the Salafists will do. They have accused the Salafists in Tunisia have publicly denounced Ennahda as a non-Islamist party that's only a creature of the West. And they demonstrated some weeks ago during the whole controversy over the film Persepolis, which was broadcast on Tunisian television, that they were ready to use violence not only against secular groups but also Ennahda supporters as well, in opposition to what they see as an un-Islamic political party, i.e. Ennahda. Under conditions of economic crisis, I think that they might mobilize and try to pressure Ennahda, and we'll see how it responds. So there's a lot of ifs here. And then the other if has been mentioned, my old friend Mohammed al-Hashmi Hamdi. Hamdi is a very smart, well-organized political opportunist. And of course that doesn't distinguish him from most politicians in that sense, but there are degrees of opportunism, and then there are degrees of opportunism. He conducted the entire campaign from London through his television station Al-Mustaqilla, which I appeared on with my colleague Stephen Heidemann about 12 years ago, and we spent 2 hours answering questions from callers throughout the Middle East. I remember one particularly inspiring moment when we got onto a discussion of the Palestine question, and callers from Saudi Arabia proposed that the solution was to kill all the Jews, the Qatl al-Yahud, and it was just an extraordinary moment when you're sitting there answering these questions. But Mohammed al-Hashmi Hamdi made a kind of reputation based on populism, using Al-Mustaqilla to reach out to populations throughout the region and engage in these sorts of conversations without any boundaries whatsoever. You could call up and say anything. And that made him a very popular voice in certain elements, in certain regions, particularly the region that he comes from, of Tunisia. And I think what happened was that he claims that there was a popular petition drive that he didn't inspire, but it arrived at his door, and he said, well, you want me? This is kind of Louisiana populist politics. It's very familiar to me. His solution for Tunisia's economic crisis is to tax the tourist industry and use the taxation from the tourist industry to give everybody a free ride and or not everybody, but to give the poor a free ride. Literally, he wants free public transportation, free health care. He proposes a mixture of Islam and British socialist Fabian labor politics. That's explicitly his formula for Tunisia. It's nuts in so many respects. But the fact that he would be embraced is indicative of the sense of alienation of the constituency that he comes from. And everybody knows as soon as you leave Tunis and you go into the countryside, you're in a different world, a world that has been left behind by the so-called Tunisian economic revolution in large part. And so the question will be for the Ennahda party, the fate of Hamdi's party is one thing, but the real question will be during this year of constitutional reform, where there will be a focus on politics, during a period of economic crisis, and during a period where those in the rural areas will probably continue to feel themselves excluded from the discussion, whether somehow they can be brought in and addressed, and whether this government can address their concerns without being tempted by the Hamdi populist solution, which isn't a solution at all. So on that score, I think we have to wait and see. It's going to be a trying and challenging year for Tunisia, but structurally speaking, I think what is extraordinary is the readiness of almost all the political parties to think seriously about a power-sharing government, that would echo not only a kind of tactical calculation of elite consensus making, but the fact that you have organized constituencies with distinct ideologies and sets of interests, and while the non-Islamist opposition is fragmented, I do think that the fact that they were able to organize their base of support so quickly under these conditions is indicative of the maturity of the Tunisian electorate and the capacity to make a transition from authoritarianism to democracy in a relatively short amount of time. And I therefore remain very optimistic about what's going to happen. Thank you very much.
can have the screen come up. We'll have a quick moderated conversation, and then we'll turn it over to your questions. I have to apologize in advance. I have to run and catch a plane at about 15 minutes, and Layla will then moderate the questions from the audience. But those were three very meaty presentations, and I don't want to repeat them, but if I could ask you when replying to my questions to keep your remarks very brief. Let's tick through a few questions that you set up that we could address in a little more depth. The first one I think I wanted to dig into is the regionalism theme that both Dan and Layla raised. Obviously, this was a revolution of the South and the central areas, the deprived areas against the coast. It started in Sidi Bouzid. It spread. The people who sacrificed themselves in front of the police and in front of the secret police early in the revolution were unemployed young men in excluded regions. And then they occupied the Kasbah with the help of the labor unions and forced the change that led to the plan for the elections. And I guess my question is, who represents them? If it's our friend from London, that doesn't seem like a very sustainable answer. If it's the case that the labor unions perform poorly as a political movement, then where will the future included politics of the excluded who started the revolution really come from, do we think? Anybody have an impression of that? Layla? You observed in some of those regions.
Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Okay. Well, I just in response, I want to say that there were high participation rates, but it was particularly amongst women, the elderly, and the male youth were conspicuously absent. And so
where were you exactly?
Well, I was in Siliana, which is a part of Tunisia that's like Sidi Bouzid. It's the interior that's underdeveloped. There's high unemployment. I mean, you have to remember that Tunisia has invested a lot of money in education compared to the other countries of the region. And so you have a highly educated male youth population who are engineers, who have professional backgrounds but have no work. And their main issue is the discrepancy between their knowledge and capacity and their opportunities, and they are alienated, and it remains a big question as to how they will be brought in. And I don't think that the options in this election resonated with the youth. And
what about the unions and the syndicates?
This is the very interesting question. Why is it that the unions were not influential in this election? And I can only sort of observe around the question, and I'll try to have other people's answer more precisely. But you have to remember also that the revolution started outside of Tunisia and was propelled forward by these unions in these interior areas. And it was only later in time that it reached Tunis and finally brought down the regime. And that transformation happened a bit through social media, but primarily the revolution was carried forth on the ground with people who don't have access, who are not involved on the internet. And perhaps the elections were very much a debate between the Islamists, who don't appeal to the professional unemployed classes in the interior, and those more elite elements who were able to mobilize along secular lines through the social media. So I think it's a question, and I'm not sure how to
one
answer
observation you're offering in response as well is that the unemployed, the professionally unemployed, which is a pretty good phrase to describe them because they are registered and almost they have a kind of identity politics of being young and unemployed and from the excluded region. They were not in line at the polling stations that you saw?
No, they were not. I mean, this is my observation, so we have to get the numbers, and these numbers will be important. But they were not, and they were on the sidelines approaching us saying, we're not voting. They're the ones who are saying that there's a lot of vote buying. They're the ones that were complaining of bias. They did not feel included in this electoral process.
Well, if that's substantial, then it's a fault line to watch.
Right.
Dan, do you have?
Well, the Tunisian labor union that had existed on the previous regime was a corporatist labor union.
Right.
It was controlled by the regime, but it provided an umbrella for a multiple set of different streams of interests, none of which were clearly defined. And there was expectations after Ben Ali's fall that the union would be in a position to organize a party that would represent these interests. But what happened is, as soon as the party system opened up, it was clearly demonstrated that the union could not make the transition from a corporatist structure to a party politics structure. And what happened is its base fragmented and went in different directions, which I think is unfortunate, but that's the way it's worked out. And so you don't have, and also there was a lot of score settling. I interviewed a lot of labor leaders when I was in Tunis. There's been a lot of score settling that's arisen out of those years of the co-optation of the main labor federation, which also sort of undermined its leadership. So maybe down the road it will be able to recapture, or the existing labor parties will be able to recapture some support. But for now, that voice has been really fragmented, and that's made it much more difficult to represent these disadvantaged elements of the population.
I mean, that sounds right to me. My own impression was that the federation, the labor federation, was a kind of tent under which all
Yes.
opposition politics played out. So when its role as a sort of shadow place for legitimate opposition politics or legal opposition politics collapsed, was no longer necessary, then real politics and diverse politics sprang up where the tent had been. And also the leadership had been co-opted and was regarded as collaborationist. And the other thought that I had looking at that pie chart was that, and you see this in the aftermath of a lot of collapsed despotisms, that those who had the most credibility, who suffered the most, Layla called it the politics of victimhood, but these were real victims, obviously. The Islamists, they took the brunt of the torture and the long imprisonments and the isolation. And there's often in the first wave, it's those who suffered the most who are immediately rewarded. Certainly Mazurki, I guess, because he had suffered in exile and had been a friend of the Islamists and had defended them when it was highly risky and unpopular, may have benefited to some degree that people didn't predict. Whereas the PDP was seen as a bit more collaborationist even in opposition. React to that?
Well, Marzouki was always totally outspoken, and from his base, sometimes in Paris, sometimes in London, he was part of the Tunisian human rights movement from the start, and was a militant in that regard. Even while many of the Tunisian human rights movement leaders were suspicious of the Islamists, in principle they defended the right to human rights, and so that's the basis for this sort of entente between him and the Nakhta party.
Right.
I agree that, you mentioned PDP sort of being seen as more co-opted. I think that's definitely the case, and especially the case now. I think they're viewed much more that way now than they were before the revolution. Most of the people voting now and taking part didn't take part in politics and didn't really follow politics very closely before the revolution. I think Najib Chebi and the PDP had, in many respects, admirably tried to stand up to the Ben Ali regime in the past, but they did take part in elections that were extremely fraudulent, and they would call them out for being fraudulent, but they would nonetheless take part, where some of the other parties that existed before the election did not. And then after the revolution, I think they came to be seen as, by people who hadn't followed things very closely, as sort of a remnant of the old era.
Right. So we should talk a little bit about Ennahda, but before that, just one question about the rally, the old ruling party, the clientelist network that Dan described so well. I mean, for those who don't know Tunisia, it had 1 million members. It functioned like a communist party in the old Soviet system, in the sense that membership was present in the workplace, promotions, and all kinds of status in institutional life required party membership. But it lacked an ideology. It was hollowing out in the center, but it was a very brutal network when it wanted to be. 1 million members in a country of what, 7 or 8? 11. So a pretty substantial 10%. And then it melted away. Now, people could burn their cards. People could say, I never believed in this. Nobody had to take off a uniform. Nobody was chased down and purged. But what was the presence of that network in this election so far as you could ever detect it?
It seemed in the end to be, less present than was fear. I mean, there was a lot of fear throughout, all the way up until the time of the election that the RCD was going to reemerge in some respect. And Leila mentioned the two parties, Watan and Mubadara, that were seen as sort of RCD lights, and that even though that there was laws passed, forbidding any high-ranking members from the party from running in elections, you had several former, ministers that were seen as the faces of parties while they weren't candidates, and then they had the kind of slate of new candidates. But in general, they have performed very poorly in the elections, and in general, as was mentioned, this was seen as sort of a real rejection of that cadre. Now, I think there would still be some anxiety, particularly, we should remember that these elections are not for anything permanent. Therefore, Constituent Assembly that will be in place for a year, and there will be writing a constitution. Then there'll be elections to permanent bodies, presumably a parliament, roughly a year from now. And if the huge challenges facing Tunisia economically, if there's not some progress seen, if there's not confidence earned by the people in the next year, we could see sort of a rejection of the parties that did well this time, and some would, there will remain some anxiety that some of the old, elements of the RCD and the former regime may return, try to return if the new actors that have come to power now are not able to deliver.
Right. And sorry, did you want to say something, Dan?
Well, I'm just going to say that the Nahda party has its distinctive features. We've been talking about them today, but there is one factor, structurally speaking, which is similar with other Islamist parties. It has a kind of modernist political leadership, but on the base, it has a younger population whose patience will be stretched, and for whom the plane of identity politics is an attractive option. And it's not easy. I mean, Ghannouchi, for the last few months, has been under continuous criticism from elements within his own party, what we might call the more fundamentalist line about his own politics and about where he's taking the party. And that is also the case for the
You mentioned the Salafis. Did they organize as a political party, or did they just throw rocks and demonstrate?
They're mostly demonstrators. I don't know if they had any party representation. I didn't think so. But you see, I mean, acting outside the party network, they can mobilize large numbers when they want to, and they could put pressure on Nahda. And given the fact that there's a stream within Nahda that has a certain sympathy for the Salafists, that could also undermine the capacity of the party to lead.
So before I turn the microphone over to Leila and head for the airport, I just wanted to ask a couple of questions about Ennahda. One is the extent to which I think it was forecasted that they would receive between 25% and 40% of the vote. That was certainly the best guess from polling and intuition. So they ended up a little bit on the high side of what people forecasted. They self-constrained in terms of their list participation and some of their strategy. They seemed careful not to get to put themselves in a position where they could threaten the West symbolically or otherwise by winning a sweeping victory. So I wonder what your sense of their 5-year strategy is. To what extent did they really self-constrain? To what extent do they have a plan? And related to that, how well prepared are they to actually govern? Their Turkish counterpart has swept from victory to victory substantially because Turkey's been growing at 7 or 8% a year of GDP growth. As you all pointed out, the Tunisian economy is quite vulnerable. It's thinly based on tourism. It has a highly educated population and has the potential to integrate more with especially Francophone Europe, but it will be hard. So how well prepared are they to actually govern, and what's their strategy?
As far as governing, I mean, you mentioned the AK Party in Turkey, and I would add that Ennahda's leadership is very close to the AK Party in Turkey, and the AK Party had dozens of, at least dozens, if not more, of kind of political experts there assisting Nahda with their sort of campaigning, their organizing, their mobilizing, and they will continue to be advising them on sort of the challenges of governing. And Nahda looks very much to the AK Party in Turkey as an example, not in terms of thought or ideology, but just in terms of the practical ability to govern effectively. And so that, but they will certainly, it's certainly a new position for them that will challenge them. I would add that they're very impressively organized internally and cohesive, and I think they've this spring they've had lots of internal discussions and debates, and they're generally relatively democratic internally. And I've been impressed to the degree to which, once they've taken positions, that it's not been clear what position they might take on an issue, but once they take it, then the entire party is there, and they might have internal split beforehand, but then maybe they vote or they reach a decision, and then the party is very cohesive. So I think that will serve to their advantage.
You can go online and see Nahda's 342-point platform or something like that. I read it in Arabic. It's probably available in English. It's beautiful photos. It's really extraordinary. It looks very Western. Let's put it that way. It sounds essentialistic, but in its presentation, and deliberately so. On economic issues, it's also, for the most part, pretty liberal. I mean, economically liberal. And one of the things that Ghannouchi has done since the election is try to reassure the Tunisian stock market, which was plummeting after the election, and that's the dilemma he faces, because you cannot solve the economic problem that Tunisia has faced through the kind of populist Hamdi economics proposed by his party, but you have to address the social issues, and how Ghannouchi and his party navigates through that thicket is going to be an interesting question.
Great. Layla, I'll let you, if you want to stand up or sit there and take questions from the audience. Thank you all for being here.
Thanks, Steve. Safe flight. So we'll open it for questions in the front row here. Please, go ahead.
My name's Li Yang. I do wonder if you can address some of the issues that compared to the United States. First is whether those candidates have a really public interest in mind, and whether the candidate or election result will be really manipulated by money or by corporation, or if they are elected but they don't listen to the United States, whether the elected official will be exiled in Haiti or in the United States, where they will be evicted and their house will be taken, and maybe even the forced influence, unjust influence. Let's say, for instance, maybe officials or CIA or sheriff, they will create false rumors like a drug addiction or something of that sort, and or they were evicted, even take the candidate's property or their house.
Thank you. I think the question is, what is the risk of corruption?
Corruption or the knowledge or the public influence or maintenance or candidate information. So voters' education, they really receive the knowledge about candidates, or whether they had probably have a maintenance of candidate information or statement or debate.
Okay.
For
thank you for your question. Yeah. Why don't we take a few and then we can answer them collectively. The gentleman here, please.
Hi, Russ.
Can you, yes, please identify yourself.
Russ Deming from SAIS. Thank you very much for really excellent presentations. My questions revolve around the Constituent Assembly. My understanding is it has really two functions, one to elect an interim president, and Professor Bloomberg suggests that it might be Necip Chebbi, which surprised me.
No, I don't think it'll be Chebbi. I think it'll be Marzuki or Jaffa.
Yeah, but where does this leave the current interim government under Mbaza and Essebsi? Is this government, when an new president is elected, does that take the place of it? What is the governor's going to be in the next year during a very difficult period economically, transition?
Okay.
And second, what are the fault lines in the debate about a constitution in terms of a presidential system, a parliamentary system, a French Fifth Republic kind of hybrid system, and the other fault lines on the role of Islam in society, the protection of women, and so on? How is this likely to play out? Thanks.
Okay. A couple more questions. This gentleman here.
My name is Mohab. I'm president of iWatch Tunisia. It's an organization fighting against corruption and leading for transparency and transitional justice. So I think that these elections were marked by mainly 2 points. The first point is the voter participation in the elections, and even the Tunisians were surprised by this high rate of voter participation, and even the polling stations open at 7 a.m. and voters were there at 10 to 7. And the second thing is the second surprise is the victory of Al-Arida Sha'biya. And I think this victory has many features because no one expected this victory. And this victory gave lesson to the elitist party and the secularist parties. And I think this lesson would say that you have to be close to the people. You have to go to the ground, and elections you cannot win elections if you stick to the banners on the streets, if you stick to television, and if you stick to newspapers.
Mm-hmm.
You should go to the streets. And I think that there's just one question to Stephen. Yesterday I read the news, an article in New York Times saying that the American NGOs were helping Tunisians to succeed their revolution, but you did not start the revolution, but you just helped Tunisians succeed their revolution. And you moved from secret help to NGO Tunisian activists to public help, and to helping the Tunisian state and the EZ, which is the Independent Election Commission. So I think you helped in succeeding these elections too. So the question is, what would be your future step and your future help to the Tunisian even state or activists?
Okay, I think that's an important question, and I know there was this issue of the constitutional fault lines and ideas for future governments, which are important, but I would like to spend a couple of minutes talking about US foreign policy directions in Tunisia, given in particular what we've seen with these elections, which is that there is this large need to address the discrepancies, economic and social discrepancies between the interior and the outlying areas, and the tendency on the part of the US to focus on free trade agreements which have privileged actually a particular part of the coastal regions of Tunisia, as well as on democracy promotion. How is it that US foreign policy can be driven now to help Tunisians address these social and economic issues that have clearly come out in the elections? Do you have any ideas?
Sure. So I mean, I'll start with that. I think the U.S. now, I mentioned earlier that the U.S. is not able right now to provide kind of large-scale assistance the way they have to countries undergoing these transitions in the past. Although they have programmed tens of millions of dollars to support Tunisia's transition. They have, as Mohab mentioned, the U.S., both the U.S. government and U.S. international organizations, I think played a valuable role in advising and supporting the EZ in running and administering elections, and as well as providing trainings to the political parties that were very eagerly received. I mean, all of the parties, all the major parties received lots of training from U.S. international organizations that are on the ground. In the months ahead, I think it'll be an important challenge for both a lot of the Tunisians and Tunisian NGOs and others to kind of adapt. There's been so much focus on these elections. Most of the NGOs that have emerged were election focused in one way or another, either on election observation and monitoring, which hundreds of Tunisian groups were focusing on, and civic education, voter education about the elections. There'll have to be a quick sort of adaptation in finding the new role, and NGOs will continue to play an important role in Tunisia, and the U.S. and other international actors will need to continue to support those. I guess I'll maybe say a few words on some of the other questions as well.
But before we go on to those questions, I actually want to continue this line of discussion and relate it to the question raised about forms of government and the constitutional framework. Because in these elections, in the campaigning and the platforms, there was this notion of regionalism and the notion of decentralization. and ensuring that the different regions of the country have a say and power and can affect overall policies for the regions and then also nationally. So Dan, can you say a few words to this?
First of all, I want to say that when I was in Tunisia, I met many activists from iWatch, not only in Tunis, but particularly outside of Tunis in the rural areas. I was very impressed because one of the things they were trying to do was engage young people and make the politics relevant to them, so they had a sense that there was some sort of bridge between their local concerns and those of the dynamics in the city. I think that's very important because we have a crisis of expectations here, and the kinds of structural problems we're talking about will take years to address even if there's a will to do so, and one hopes there will be, the will and the resources. So in the interim, particularly during this coming year, you've got to find ways to get people engaged so they have a sense that they are participants, and that's easy to do in Tunis. It's much more difficult to do in groups like iWatch and others are part of that sort of activity. I would hope that they would increase those activities. Your projects on constitutionalism, on web constitutions, for example, I think that's one thing that can be done, but obviously it only reaches certain kinds of people with access to the web. So there's a lot to be done in terms of addressing the expectations. The challenge for Tunisia is to address the economic issues and find ways to develop the rural areas and have local economic development, at the same time not sort of play the Hamdi card, which is a kind of populism which could send money out of Tunisia. I mean, the neo-market sort of reforms had many negatives to them, but the solution is simply not to try to sort of undermine the private sector completely in ways that will harm everybody's interests. There's got to be a balanced approach to this, and I think the challenge is to find that balance. And U.S. economic support and support from Europe can play a role in that. So it's going to have to be a mixture of different sorts of policies to get through this difficult year, and to secure a constitution that provides democratic rights, and at the same time begin to engage on a rethinking of the economic model, which wouldn't be a wholesale abandonment of the model, but would be an adjustment of that model.
If I could add also on the question about the government during this next interim period, it's expected, the only sort of really clearly defined role for the Constituent Assembly is to write the Constitution, but it's been generally expected that they will appoint a new cabinet, a new government, and as well as an interim president. The only prominent candidate that had, Najib Chebi in the PDP, had sort of publicly advocated leaving the current interim government in place, but it appears clearly that won't happen. Although I expect that some members will remain in place. Qaida Sebsi, there's some talk about him either remaining in place or being appointed to a new position in the government. Nahda, I believe a few days ago, said that they will most likely keep the current finance minister in place. I think it's part of a signal to outside investors that they're. So I think there'll be there'll basically be a new government that includes several key members will be held over during this period.
Okay, we've gone beyond 10:30, but we have a few urgent hands in the air, so we'll take another round of questions. Please, go ahead.
My name is Louis Cohen, Peace Corps volunteer in the 60s, a dynamic time, and in the embassy as economic counselor at the dawn of the Ben Ali era. And just back, I was there in August as well, and I agree with much of what has being said. My questions are sort of twofold. One, in terms of human and economic resources, there is a large Tunisian diaspora in Europe, some of whom are thinking seriously of coming back, and there's a lot of talent there. And in terms of resources, twofold. One, the Ben Ali plunder. How much of that is actually recoverable? I've heard estimates in the $10 to $15 billion range, both offshore and within Tunisia. And the other one is the great store of goodwill that's been built up in Libya as a result of the Tunisians' real welcome of 100,000 plus refugees and the sustenance of those refugees. To the extent that Tunisian manpower, brain power, and Libyan money can come together over the next X years, there's real potential for something good happening in the region. And on the other side of the border in Algeria, is that the next domino to fall? And how active have the Algerians been in supporting people interested in undermining the process in Tunisia? They were active in supporting Gaddafi. and I suspect they were active in supporting, some nefarious elements in Tunisia.
Thank you. So we'll take the question here. And in the interest of time, can you keep it just brief?
I will do my best. Jim Fippard, former USAID mission director in Tunis and former president of the American and Tunisian Association. I want to follow up on your point, Leila, because I think what the U.S. does now is extremely important. And I think they could look back to the focus of the aid program back in the Bourguiba days. And there was a great interest at that time in integrating the center, the poorer parts of Tunisia with the coastal areas. That much of the assistance went there in terms of assistance to farmers, health programs in Siliana, a whole range of activities. And I think it would be important for U.S. policymakers to look back and say, we really need to look back and see which policies worked so that we can work on this issue of regionalism. And I guess my question is, does anybody know what U.S. policy is, and are they looking at this in terms of the problems of regionalism?
Okay. We have.
Good morning. I'm Sana Karay from Tunisia. Actually, I have some comments. So the first comment that it was the first transition, I think, revolution transition from a civil state to a civil state. It wasn't a revolution against a military regime or against a communist regime, but it was against a despotic regime. And I think that we succeed such transition owing to the High Commission of Protecting Revolution and so on, which assembled many political parties and many associations and NGO. And I think that the civil society contributed to accelerate the revolution at the beginning and even to succeed a transition in a civil society. And one of the things that I really appreciated 2 days or 3 days ago, it was thanks to Qaid Sebsi and to the government, thanks to Ayad Ben Ashur, the president of this High Commission, which assembled political parties and the civil society, and thanks to our state force and so on, because they succeeded to make this transition. So I think that civil society in Tunisia played a major role in this transition, and I think that we need to strengthen the civil society now to a next step, which is maturity and awareness, because to face populism, such populism of Mohamed Hashmi Hamdi, we have to aware, especially young people and Tunisian people, that we have prerequisites to achieve democracy, and these prerequisites are a kind of healthy economic and right economic policies, not short solutions, and we have to make this through civil society associations and NGOs. So I think that we need the help of the United States to strengthen NGOs, civil society, and eventually public and state institutions.
Thank you.
Yeah.
So I'm going to take 2 more questions. We'll go to this side of the room, and then alternate back over.
Thank you. Good morning. Thank you very much. My name is Dr. Latiri. I am with the WHO. I am a Tunisian. I'm very proud of what has happening in our countries. I hope things will get better. One question about the elections. It was not mentioned in details about the role of Dr. Mustafa bin Jafar, the political party of DTL. My understanding is that his party is probably the 3rd winning the number of seats. So do you think that party will have anything to play in the future? 2 elements, in my opinion, played a major role in these elections. One is, of course, the role of the mosques and the Islamists, and the other role you mentioned very well, and I think you hit the nail on the head, and it is the absence of the young professionals and educated in these elections. That is very interesting point that you have made. I would like to know also that, as you all of know, one of the most element that rise this revolution is really the unemployment, especially the educated people who have studied 3, 4, 5, 6 years after the baccalaureate, and they have been without job for many years, and they continue staying there. So 1 year has gone, and not much was done really. And now another year is going to come, and we would like to see what's going to happen to those people who are sitting at home or in the cafe. Do you have any idea? Thank you.
Okay, thank you. One more question, this gentleman in the back.
Hi, Jeff Katz. I'm formerly with the World Bank, and it's really a follow-up to the previous question. I'd like to have, if somebody could comment on what's happening socially. That is to say, are there real changes in the private institutions that were clientelist? What happens if one wants to get a permit today? Is that any different than it was a year ago? And what's happening with the institutions of government in this interim period, which may last now for at least a year?
Okay, thank you. So I'm going to turn it over to my fellow panelists to provide initial answers and just keep it short, I suppose, so we don't delay people much longer.
Okay, I'll quickly address several of the points that were raised. Libya, I think, is the role of Libya is extremely important, and I think there is a strong connection that's been forged this year between the Libyan people. I feel as though they kind of owe something to Tunisian people, both by sort of being inspired by their revolution, and then, of course, as you mentioned, hundreds of thousands, I believe, of Libyans came to Tunisia, and of course, Libya has lots of oil and wealth and resources that Tunisia doesn't have, and it's seen as a very important market, and economic ties there are very important. So I hope that will be an important part of Tunisia's sort of economic rehabilitation. In Algeria, I haven't seen a lot of evidence of Algeria playing a negative role or interfering in Tunisia in these months, although certainly that's been feared. And is it going to be the next domino to fall? I think the Algerian government has sort of taken a very strong stance to prevent that. I mean, Algeria, should be remembered, was actually the second country in the region to have protests this year. Before the protests spread from Tunisia to Egypt, they spread to Algeria, but they were put out kind of more brutally. The Algerian military was willing to be more brutal than either the Tunisian or Egyptian military in preventing it, and I think they will continue to be so, at least in the short term. But who knows beyond that. U.S. aid, U.S. aid is there. U.S. aid's Office of Transition Initiatives has set up a couple of offices in the country, and there is a lot of recognition on the need to kind of focus on the interior and rebuild a lot of the less developed countries. There's also a recognition of the need for U.S. aid to support NGOs and civil society, and so I think that will continue also. Mustafa bin Jafar and Takatul, I think certainly they will play a role. I mean, it looks as though they'll be in a coalition. The most prominent members of the coalition will be Nahda CPR, the Congress pour la République, and Takatul, and I think Nahda certainly wants them in the coalition. I think it's one thing I'd mention. I think it's very fortunate that and there was some mention of some self-restraint, and it's fortunate that no party, that Nahda nor any other party has a simple majority. I think that would put a lot of pressure on. If any party were to have 50% or more of the seats, the fact that it looks like Nahda currently has 41%, and they may end up with a few percent more than that. They very much want to have secular parties like Takatul in their coalition with them, so that all the pressure for the results is not put on them. In general, on kind of economic economic crisis, I think there's been patience. Over the past year, there's been the Tunisian population understands that their economic woes have not been remedied, by the revolution as of yet. In general, I think there's been a lot of patience in understanding that it's going to take some time. There is a risk that in the months ahead, after these elections, I think it will be important, in this 1 year period until sort of a constitution is ratified and more permanent bodies are elected. I think it's important not to see all sort of the economic problems solved and fixed, but I think it will be important to see some tangible symbolic progress, some tangible additional investment or something to give people confidence that this body is at least moving things in the right direction. Otherwise, you could start to see some unrest emerge. I'll turn it to Dan.
Well, very quickly, it's impressive that Tunisia under Ben Ali didn't have and couldn't have much of an active civil society movement, in contrast to the civil society activism that existed under the quasi-authoritarian regime in Egypt. And the fact that there was so much mobilization so quickly, and that mobilization did play an important role in the initial months of keeping the revolution on track. And so there's a lot of energy there, and the question is how to harness it before it dissipates, because it's not going to be there forever, and how to engage it and how to support it at the same time, how to maintain its authenticity, because USA programs can come in offering a lot of money, and then suddenly it becomes a rent-seeking game, and we know the consequences of that. So we have to figure out how to have a partnership. The institutional and organizational capacity of many of these young civil society organizations is weak. They're not in a position to accept money. The issue of the simple question of bank transfers presents challenges, just to take one example. It's not a small issue. So there's lots to be done if we can figure out a partnership that can help these groups build their organizational capacity and sustainability, which is a kind of catchword that's been around for a long time, but it's important. At the same time, we have to be able to make sure that this engagement and effort to assist civil society groups doesn't come at the expense of political society, because parties are important. And in the Arab world, often civil society organizations mobilize as a substitute for political society, and that's not a formula that in the long term is good for democracy. So there has to be some partnership between parties and some division of labor. And so there's a whole set of challenging issues in that regard. And the moment has arrived, or it arrived already, but it won't last that long. We have to find ways to jump on the opportunity and pursue these discussions so this energy is harnessed in the right direction.
I just want to follow up with one question, and that is there another country outside of the Arab world, presumably, that we can look to provide examples to encourage this balance between political engagement and civil society activism? That's one question. And two, is there really a rethink going on within U.S. policy circles about how to distribute aid and conduct assistance in a manner that will actually address these emerging issues in the Arab Spring? So those are sort of two questions. And because the idea is to be thinking, to do forward-looking thinking in order to provide some kind of context for working through these very important questions.
Well, I mean, that's a tough question. I mean, I suppose one country that did get the balance right was Indonesia. If you're looking for an example where that sort of division of labor worked out in a useful way, because the civil society groups that existed under the previous authoritarian regime were able to delegate certain kinds of energies and resources to the party sphere, at the same time maintain a coherence as civil society groups, and there was a partnership that emerged. It's a very unique experience. It's very hard to get that balance right, and I think it's very hard to go to Tunisia and say, well, look, there's your model, Indonesia, go to Jakarta or something like that. I mean, you've got to be able to make this indigenous and speak. And so you want to use these examples to remind people that it's important to get the balance right, but it has to be something that speaks to the immediate challenges on the ground.
On the other question, on USAID, there is a real effort now in the administration to sort of try to rethink, how can we be supportive of these transitions. There's been a new Office of Middle East Transition set up, headed by Bill Taylor, who had for some time headed a similar office on guiding and supporting transitions in Eastern Europe in the 1990s. And I know that office and the Office of Policy Planning at the State Department are doing a lot of thinking about exactly these questions. How can we use aid, and also how can we use aid at a time when our budget for our aid is restricted, but to still have a positive impact. And so I think we'll see some kind of new initiatives come out of that.
Okay, great. Well, I want to thank everyone for coming and participating in what was a very early morning start. I think these are quite interesting questions that are playing out specifically in Tunisia. If Egypt holds its election in a month, I'm not sure that we will be having the same kinds of assessment conversations, and I suspect that the issues will be a bit more different. But so we need to continue focusing on developments in Tunisia. Thank you very much.